I'm Zosia Beckles. I'm a research information analyst from the research support unit at the in library services at the University of Bristol, and I'm going to talk to you today about to give an overview of our sensitive data support service as a whole, but also focusing in on a couple of areas where we're sort of particularly focused on providing support to researchers. Okay. So, as an overview of what we want to talk about, firstly, a quick look at the history of the research data service at the university, and then answer these three kind of key support areas that we're focusing on at the moment. Consent forms being one of them. So yeah, just to echo what Mary was saying earlier, this is something that we're still having problems with. Yeah, so you were definitely not alone there. And then finally, I'll just quickly talk about some of the changes to our service that we've seen due to the pandemic. Okay, so just kind of give you an overview. The research data service at Bristol launched in 2014. This was initially just a support and training offering, so there was no infrastructure behind that. But then in 2015, we launched the data.brist research data repository, built on CCAN. And initially, we only offered open data deposit. But then in 2017, we started offering restricted and controlled data access as well. And this sort of went alongside the development of a dedicated data access committee, which is formed of some senior academics, members of the research data service, IT, research governance, research contracts, Secretary's Office for Data Protection Oversight. I think that's all the expertise we've got on there. And yeah, as I mentioned, some senior academics, so we've got their view as well. So it's a really, really valuable group. And not only do they look at incoming requests for data access, they also advise on issues around data publication. We're entirely sure if something can be published, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Okay, so in terms of the first area where we offer support, it's one of the things that we're focusing on still at the moment is advising researchers on issues around GDPR and the Data Protection Act. So this is things like what the preferred legal basis is for data collection. We recommend public task. There's a couple of different reasons for that, but one of them primarily relates to the issues around consent forms and wording of consent forms. So I'll cover that in the next slide. The other thing we talk to researchers about a lot is the data subject rights that they need to be aware of, as well as the ones that can be exempted if they're processing for research purposes, and also the conditions they have to meet to show that they are processing for research purposes. And then finally, structuring privacy notices, which again feeds into the consent form and patient participant information sheet issue. So yeah, so that's kind of one key area. The second thing that we are devoting a lot of bandwidth to at the moment is trying to get consent forms right. This is sort of an ongoing problem and has been for a very long time, even though we've been sort of banging this drum for several years. Again, we, as Mary said, we also none of us sit on a data access committee, on an ethics committee, but we do go and talk to them a couple of times a year to just sort of reiterate this issue, but still, we're still seeing this problem. Similarly, I think it's because our ethics systems and sort of project management, research management systems aren't integrated. Hopefully that is changing in the future. So hopefully we'll have a bit more control over the way in which ethics, these forms are approved, essentially. But yeah, so one of the key things that we try and stress is that ethical consent to participate in a study is not the same as consent for data processing under GDPR. And in fact, the two things should be quite separate if indeed you're relying on consent as your basis for processing data. The issue being that you need to separate out what you're doing with research data from what you're doing with personal information that's needed for administrative purposes. Because too often we see that these things are conflated, it's not clear what's going to happen to both kinds of data. It's not going to be clear. It's not clear how long they think they'll be kept for, who's going to have access to them, or indeed what happens to them if a participant withdraws. So just as a quick example, similarly to some of the things Mary was saying, these are two consent form clauses on the same consent form, one saying that data will be kept confidential and one saying that data will be used by other researchers after the project ends. So yeah, exactly the same problem. It's just, possibly this was all explained verbally to the participant, but there's no way to know that from the text. And what, as data publishers, if we get a consent form like this accompanying a data set for publication, we can't publish it as it is. So either we have to ask the researcher to go back and reconsent, or this is where our data access committee can come in. So in certain cases, particularly where for legacy data sets where the data set's quite old, so there's just no possibility of going back to reconsent participants, what we'll do is get the data access committee to look at the data set, look at the risk of disclosure, the risk to the participants, the risk to the university, to the researcher of releasing that data set versus the benefits to research in general, to society, to releasing the data set, get the committee to weigh those things and give an opinion on whether they think the data set could be released despite the consent being ambiguous or indeed missing. And on occasion, they have a rule that it can be released, always under controlled, as a controlled data set. So again, any incoming requests will need to be assessed by the Data Access Committee to ensure that they're sort of in line with the original purposes for which the data was collected and this sort of thing. So that we have, so I said we have managed to publish data sets even where there is this kind of ambiguous consent, but it is a very complicated process involving a lot of time and effort from people all across the university. So trying to sort this consent form issue out at the beginning of the research life cycle would cut out a lot of effort later on. So that's kind of where we're focusing a lot of our energies at the moment. Okay, so the third area that that we're focused on, with regards to sensitive data, at least there's lots of other things our team is doing, is disclosure risk assessments. So this is a relatively new service. We launched it in about mid-2019. And the idea here is that for data sets that are deposited with us that contain information on human participants, we want to be able to do some additional checks to assure ourselves that the risk of publishing those is acceptable with regards to the risk of re-identification of participants. We also wanted somebody who would be able to provide a sort of slightly higher level of advice on formal and statistical anonymisation to researchers, and also a single point again to be able to advise on appropriate access levels, so functional anonymisation for data sets. And so the way we did that was to draw up a new job description, a new post. This is me. It's a full-time post. It's equivalent to a research data librarian, but with a slightly different title, research information analyst, because essentially it's split across two roles. So half is research metrics support, so bibliometrics, altmetrics support for researchers, and the other half is sensitive data. Realistically, at the moment, it's more like 70% time on sensitive data. It's just the way the demand has been over the last year and a half. I keep sort of thinking that it'll even out, but so far it hasn't also. Yeah, and so in terms of the sensitive data support, what that kind of consists of is carrying out disclosure risk assessments for data sets that contain sensitive data, and also providing training and guidance for academics who are working with sensitive data. And I'll talk a bit more about the risk assessments in the next couple of slides. Okay, so how does this kind of fit into our existing data publication workflow? So first of all, if we receive a request, it goes through an initial assessment by our assistant data librarian. They'll just basically have a look at it, see whether or not there's a consent form, and have a look at the basic overview of the data to see if it's got anything from human participants. If it doesn't, it just goes through to our standard dataset pre-publication checks, so looking for a read-me file, file inventory, those sorts of things. But if it does, that's when it gets shunted to me, and I'll go through some additional checks. But in either case, both of those processes kick off a sort of iterative conversation with the depositor about getting the dataset up to standard and ready for publication. So what do those checks consist of? First of all, I'll do an assessment of the key variables in the dataset. So this would be things like age, gender, if there's any information on geographic location, occupation, things like that. But I'll also be looking at the wider data environment. So this might be, for example, is there a protocol accompanying the dataset or accompanying the manuscript, and does that have additional information that could be used to that could be added to what's in the dataset to potentially identify participants? The same goes for the manuscript. Does that have additional information in it? Are there other related datasets out there that again could be linked to the dataset in question? The second thing I'll do is a fairly sort of simple-ish process, which is just looking for direct identifiers, so names, email addresses, that sort of thing. And there are a number of tools from the UK Data Service that help with that. And that's relatively straightforward. It's the first and the third things that kind of really take the time. And and the third thing is for quantitative data sets, trying to come up with an assessment of disclosure risk via various statistical measures. So the pseudo risk score and looking at the level of K anonymity in the data set for different groups of variables. The idea here is there isn't a specific risk level beyond which it's not acceptable to publish and below which it is. This is much more subjective because of all the other things that that could affect the disclosure risk. So what other information is out there, the size of the data set, all this kind of stuff. It's whilst I'm sure there are services which take a much more black and white is the wrong way, but a much more kind of structured view of what an acceptable risk level is. What the approach that I've taken is more, as I say, subjective. It's more about having a conversation with the researcher to kind of point out these are areas where there may be risk. Here are some things that you could do to address that, but it's always with a view to, will taking these actions, it might reduce the risk of disclosure, but what's going to be the knock-on effect on utility of the data set? And again, that's something that I can't really speak to because I'm not the expert in this particular data set. That is the researcher's speciality. So yeah, so it's always a conversation between the two of us. Sorry, I'm just minimizing now. So as I said, the next thing will be to have a conversation with the depositor to start a conversation on what the risks are in the data set and what they might do to mitigate those risks. So that could be, as I said, functional anonymization, so controlling the way the data is released, or it could be to apply some non-perturbative disclosure control methods, so suppressing outliers, this sort of thing. If anything beyond that is required, so for example, adding noise to a data set or more complex statistical processes to minimize disclosure risk, then I would at that point be passing them on to, for example, our data intensive research unit, Gene Golding Institute, because that's beyond what I've described as that's kind of where my comfort zone ends. So those are the kinds of things I would be suggesting to researchers. In the process of doing these assessments, the data itself will never leave our secure research data storage facility. So I'm I'll be granted read-only access to a specific data set in order to carry out these assessments. The data itself will stay in that location. It's just the report scripts and analysis logs that will be exported. And again, only kind of shared within my team or with the specific researcher in question. Yeah, so that's kind of a quick look at the disclosure assessment process as it currently stands. It's, as I say, is still a relatively new service, so kind of being developed as time passes. But that's kind of where we are at the moment. So just quickly, just to talk about how things have changed a bit in light of COVID. As you might expect, we've vastly expanded our online training. That's in sensitive data and in other areas. What we chose to do was to focus on one-to-one consultations at the beginning of lockdown, because what we were finding was that the advice we were getting from research governance and IT services about the best tools to use for online data collection and things like that, the advice was changing so quickly that we found it was better to talk to researchers one-on-one in order to give them the most up-to-date information, as opposed to trying to create any kind of standard block of teaching that we could deliver over and over again. Simply because that information was changing so often. As of the beginning of this year, things have settled down a bit, so we've moved back to giving sort of live webinars for training. What we noticed was that there was an initial decline in requests to publish data sets and a commensurate uptick in the amount of incoming data access requests, presumably because people couldn't collect data themselves, so they were looking to reuse what was already there. But we found that in recent months, this has kind of more or less returned to the original ratios. And the other thing that we've been doing a lot, well, not a lot more of, but trying to do slightly more of, is sort of coordinate outreach activities with other library teams, other professional services, research support units, and faculty and school research directors, just to sort of keep researchers aware of what's out there and what's available for them, even if they're not able to come and find us and talk to us face to face or go into physical libraries, because keeping up that kind of level of contact and awareness was something that we thought was really important to maintain during lockdown. Right, so I think I've just squeaked in before 11:30. That's it for me.